you all for joining us this morning for what employers need to know about workplace safety as the pandemic hopefully winds down. We are being joined by Jim Yates from Eastman and Smith, and he's going to get the presentation going. But before he does, if you could all please mute your devices, and we'd prefer you turn off your video to help with streaming. We are going to save all questions towards the end, but feel free to use the chat throughout the presentation to ask your questions. And just so you know, this webinar will be recorded. However, we are stopping the recording for the Jim, I am going to hand it over to you.
Okay, thanks, Emily. This will be really everything you always wanted to know about workplace safety issues in the pandemic in an hour or less. So probably have about a day's worth of materials to cover, and tomorrow we'd probably have another day. So employers are really wrestling with a lot of these safety issues, in part because the circumstances sort of on the ground are changing every day. You know, the Ohio is in the process, we think, of reopening and issuing, the Ohio Department of Health is issuing new guidance every day, and it seems, and certainly the CDC is. So we are struggling with trying to keep on top of some of this information, and at the same time, OSHA has issued a national emphasis program on COVID-related workplace safety, and is threatening to issue a new temporary standard on COVID-related workplace safety, which may be imminent. So we may see that today or next week, but we'll talk about what we think is going to be in it a little bit. So hopefully we're getting good news about vaccines. People are getting vaccinated, and hopefully we can get a chance at some sense of normalcy again. So let's talk about some of these workplace safety issues and what employers are doing out there, what the government agencies are doing out there, what we have to watch out for as far as trying to run our business at the same time, and at the same time trying to keep up with all this, really the onslaught of information. So we have some very recent developments in Ohio regarding COVID issues, some recent pronouncements by the governor and the Ohio Department of Health. Everyone is trying to keep up with the latest and greatest information regarding vaccines, quarantines, and what employers can and can't do relative to vaccines, quarantining employees, and then each state is different. So we have Ohio going one direction, and some states are more wide open than Ohio, and some states are less restrictive. Some states are less restrictive than Ohio. Some states are more restrictive than Ohio. So we'll take a look at some of what's going on in some of these other states, and as you will see, different states treat COVID issues dramatically different. So Michigan, much different than Ohio, much different than than Indiana. New York and California are much different than other states. So if you have employees in other states, you really have to be cognizant of some of these rules that we're going to talk about in other states. The Biden administration has issued some guidance already, and promises to issue more guidance in the very, very near future. So we'll get into that a little bit. And then what are the challenges for employers and some of the ways employers have been handling those challenges, and the legal risk that some of us may not have thought of that are out there, and how do we minimize some of those legal risks? All in an hour or less. So we'll see how much we can get to. Well, first of all, regarding regarding quarantine options, the Ohio Department of Health has, fairly recently given us 3 options following in the CDC's footsteps. So this has been very, very disruptive for employees and certainly employers who've been trying to operate their businesses, keep their businesses going, and then somebody has an exposure, and then those employees have to quarantine, and some of our clients refer that as hopping on the quarantine carousel. So you have your employees get on the quarantine carousel, and then they can come back to work in 14 days, and then have another exposure, have to hop back on the quarantine carousel. Someone in their family is exposed to somebody who's positive, or their kids are positive, participating in sports activities, and then the individual employee has to hop back on the quarantine carousel, stay home, quarantine. So at least the Ohio Department of Health has recently recognized that employers have some more flexibility here. It used to be, if you're exposed to someone who is either COVID positive or suspected to be COVID positive, that you would have to quarantine for 14 days and self-monitor. And Ohio, following the CDC's lead, has provided us with a couple other options. And the second option is you only have to quarantine for 10 days and you self-monitor during that time period. And if you're symptom-free, then you can come back after 10 days. And then CDC and the Ohio Department of Health have also said that you could actually go to an option 3, which would be quarantine for 7 days and then take a test after 5 days or later. And if that test is negative, then you can return after those test results. So 7 days, if you had a negative test result for a test that you took day 5 or later. And those are not recommended for what the CDC and the Ohio Department of Health terms as high density workplaces. So workplaces where it's very difficult, if not impossible, to social distance, for the 6 feet and the amount of time they want you to social distance. So work not appropriate for workplaces with large numbers of employees, customer-facing positions, larger numbers of interactions with the public. So they do not recommend the 7 days, and they say the 14 days is still the gold standard. Now, hopefully, with more people getting vaccines, and also a lot of people have been COVID positive already, so there's a natural immunity that they've developed. Maybe we're sort of coming to an end with a lot of these quarantine issues, or at least there may be some light at the end of the tunnel, so employees can stay in the workplace. So as far as the vaccines go, the CDC just came out on March 8th and said that if you have individuals that are fully vaccinated, which means if they had the Johnson & Johnson vaccine shot, that's just one shot. So, or if they've had the Pfizer or Moderna, they've had both of their shots, and they have served the requisite 2-week waiting period. So 2 weeks after their last shot, that those individuals do not have to quarantine if they've been exposed to somebody that's COVID positive. So that's good news. Another good reason for folks to get vaccines, and another good reason for employers to want their employees to get vaccinated. Also, if someone tested COVID positive and it's been 3 months or less since they've been COVID positive, the CDC says that those individuals also don't have to quarantine because they have a natural immunity that's built up that the studies have shown lasts at least 3 months. And just a study last week came out from the Lancet, and that study was the first very large scale study dealing with immunity of folks that have had COVID. And that study showed that the immunity in most cases lasts for at least 6 months. So that's some good news too for folks that have been COVID positive. And those individuals, according to CDC, they haven't changed their guidance yet, but 3 months, if they've been COVID positive in the last 3 months, they don't have to quarantine. And if you've been completed your vaccine regimen, you don't have to quarantine. So some good news on the quarantine front, good news on the vaccine front and immunity front. And again, these types of regulations regarding quarantining is changing on a daily basis. So Ohio just announced that I just got a letter this week from just yesterday from my high school kids school system that indicates that, if you're a student athlete in high school, you do not have to quarantine if you have an incidental exposure in the classroom following your school's symptom-based guidance. And by the way, now, instead of social distancing in schools being 6 feet, I think we've all heard this by now, last week, it was the Ohio Department of Health guidance was that you really only had to social distance 3 feet to try to get kids back in school, and most of them in Ohio are. So only 3 feet social distancing in classrooms now, with some special exceptions on the quarantine requirements for athletes. So again, some good news on that front. You also may not have known that Ohio on March 10th issued some guidance and indicated that there's no longer a travel advisory for individuals that had gone out of state to another state with a high incident of COVID infection. So that is gone and done. I know a lot of employers struggled with that issue because some employees were going to, high incident, high infection, COVID infection states for a vacation or a wedding. And then the previous guidance was, well, if that state hit a certain number, 15% positive testing rate, that when you got back to Ohio, you'd have to quarantine for 14 days. We don't have to worry about that anymore as of March 10th in Ohio. So that's also is good news for Ohio employers. The curfew expired at the end of February. Self-service food stations are allowed to reopen with some restrictions. So as we enter into the baseball season and spring and summer months, county fair season, it looks like we're going to be able to have baseball again, like the slideshows for Mud Hens, Fifth Third Field, and also county fairs and state fairs. March 11th, the Ohio Department of Health issued an order allowing the reopening of fairs and outdoor grandstands. Now, for now, there's still restrictions attached to that. So if it's an outdoor event, then you're limited to 30% of the capacity of that venue, and the seats are still supposed to be 6 feet apart. If it's an indoor venue, you're limited to 25% of the capacity. So don't know when we're going to see further opening up and loosening of those restrictions. Hopefully we can get back to, watching sporting events and also some concerts that we haven't been able to go to in a while. The restrictions also indicate that even, if there's social distancing at these events, and even if you're at 25% for indoors, 30% for outdoor events, you still are subject to mask wearing, unfortunately. So, so people are still going to have to wear facial coverings at these events, and the Ohio Department of Health order, most recent order, also says no shaking hands or quote high five. So we won't be able to high five after a home run at a Mud Hens game for a little while until those rules change again. But at least we're able to go to those events at 30%. So, and we'll see with the rate of vaccines now in Ohio and throughout the country, maybe those restrictions will loosen up even more in the coming months. Did want to bring up this slide on indoor air quality assistance program. So this was a BWC program. There's $28 million available from the federal government, but it's run through the Ohio BWC. And this is for improvements in indoor air quality, improvements to heating, ventilation, and air conditioning systems, which include inspections and maintenance and upgrades to HVAC systems. Now, the grants were formerly available really for the top 3 bullet points: nursing homes, assisted living centers, and adult daycare centers, or adult day centers. And but just recently, the Ohio BWC has expanded the eligibility for those grants to intermediate care facilities, hospices, senior centers, adult care facilities, group homes, and substance use treatment centers. So if you if you are in any of those sort of programs, or if your business touches on any of those types of facilities, there's money available. So the applications are available at bwc.ohio.gov. So I thought that was important to mention for folks that touch on those types of facilities. Might as well take advantage of some of those funds if you have the need. So this is, some of you might have heard about Governor DeWine's recent pronouncements. He indicates that he's trying to reopen, and he'll continue to reopen, and he will get rid of all of the any sort of restrictions, COVID-related restrictions, if we get down to 50 cases per 100,000 residents. So if you look at, as of last week, we were at, if you at the very far right of this slide, as of last week, we're at 143.8 cases, but look at where we were really in December. I mean, we were up to 845 cases per 100,000 residents. So we've had quite a dramatic drop, and hopefully with vaccines and we can further reduce that and maybe get that down to the 50, and we can get rid of all those restrictions. There's more testing available now. We have federal funds that have really funded a lot of these different testing centers. So you can actually go to the library and get at-home tests. You know, these are all available free of charge. So in some of these at-home tests and through federal government funding. So a lot of testing available now. This vaccine chart was as of last week. So the updated numbers in Ohio as of yesterday are 24.14% of Ohioans have received at least one vaccination shot. So that's 2.8 million Ohio residents, 24.14%, which is about the same percentage in Lucas County. So Lucas County has about the same rate of vaccinated individuals. I thought it was interesting and actually very positive that there's about 70% of individuals that are 70 years old and over have received at least started the vaccination process, if not completed it. So that's good news. We're in phase 2C. Ages 40 and over can get the vaccine, and really beginning next week, where everyone can get it. So individuals 16 and 17 can get Pfizer, and I think Moderna is 18 and up, but really everyone is going to be eligible to get that vaccine. That's over 16 or over 18, as the case may be, by March 29th. So the vaccination programs are going are really dramatically increasing the amount of folks that are vaccinated on a daily basis. So the questions we've been getting from our clients with respect to vaccines, I threw a few of them up there. This is sort of a subject that employers are having to deal with in the workplace and evaluate some of these concerns. Should we, as an employer, require our employees to be vaccinated? Can we? So I think the answer to that question is yes, with some exceptions. So an employer could make the vaccine mandatory under certain circumstances, and then you would have to accept people or provide reasonable accommodations to people that have a disability related request for an accommodation, and also a religious related request for an accommodation. So if somebody has a sincerely held religious belief and that would prohibit them from getting the vaccination, employers have to look at that request and evaluate that request and provide accommodations if at all possible. The same thing with disability. So can you require folks to provide some evidence really of the disability that would require them to not get the vaccine? Well, sure. So you do need to consider those issues. So if somebody says, I can't, you're making the vaccine mandatory for us, I can't do that because of this disability related reason or this religious related reason, you have to analyze that request and make an analysis of whether or not you can accommodate those requests. So most of the I guess the industries that would require vaccines would be health related, pharmacies, first responders, and then some what I would call, again, high density workplaces, these meat processing plants where people have to work, sort of side by side, by definition, can't social distance. So those types of places, or if people have a large percentage of their time is spent dealing with public in areas of high community spread. Those are the types of organizations that are really requiring the vaccines. The latest study that I saw indicated that really a very small percent, less than 5% of employers are actually requiring employees to get the vaccine. But 80% of employers are strongly encouraging employees to get the vaccine. Can you require documentation of the exceptions? We covered that. What about documentation of getting the vaccine itself? Can we offer incentives to employees to get the vaccine? So if you offer incentives to employees to obtain the vaccine, there is a legal risk that others that chose not to get the vaccine or had a disability or religious related exemption from getting the vaccine aren't getting those same incentives or benefits. So they could possibly challenge those incentives. So what many employers are doing is providing paid time off to get the vaccine. And I think I have a slide on that next, but so if you provide a few hours, some paid time off, if they're salaried workers, employers are providing a bonus paid day off in order to, as an incentive to obtain the vaccine. Many employers are providing not only several hours to get the vaccine, but then also providing paid time off that may be in addition to other time off that they had on the books, if there are any complications from getting the vaccine and someone has to be out another day because they're fatigued or having side effects from getting the vaccine. So that's really what's currently going on in the in the vaccine world, and offering incentives about getting those vaccines. Kroger is paying employees $100 as an incentive, a cash incentive, again, paid time off, and then another question that comes up is how much information should employers be providing? If we want to encourage employees to get the vaccine, we don't really want to be providing medical information or medical advice to our employees. So how much information should we provide? How should we provide that information? So what we're seeing is a lot of employers are just providing links to different resources for employees. Actually, the Ohio Department of Health has a pretty good information system at vaccine.coronavirus.ohio.gov. So if you guide employees there, they have just a treasure trove of information about vaccines, and also the Centers for Disease Control. So CDC has a lot of information and probably the most current information about vaccines. And Ohio even has a chat line or chat or chat group that you can go and ask questions. So the employer won't be providing answers to those questions, but the employer can actually send employees to vaxchat.ohio.gov. So vaxchat.ohio.gov, and there will be individuals that can try to walk people through some of the questions that they may have about vaccines. Just the last word on that point is Krispy Kreme just announced that if you pull into a Krispy Kreme store and you show them your card that you received when you got vaccinated, they will give you a free donut. So if that's not enough incentive to get people to get their vaccine, I don't know what is. As I indicated, that here's some of the trends. New York and California. California just passed a law requiring up to 2 weeks of paid leave for COVID symptoms or seeking a vaccination or side effects related. And New York public employees must be given up to 4 hours paid time off for each vaccine injection. So some states are sort of interjecting themselves into this and passing laws actually requiring paid time off. So you have to be careful again about different rules, different laws, different regulations in different states. And a case in point, you can see the streets of New York are relatively abandoned at this point, and conversely, the picture on the left are spring breakers this past weekend at Miami Beach, and my city of Miami had to basically shut down the causeway and place curfews because they had such an influx of spring breakers, and it was really no stopping them from being close to each other and not socially distancing and drinking and doing all kinds of the things that spring breakers do. So again, Florida, relatively open state with very few restrictions. New York, sort of the opposite end of that spectrum. And also along those lines, we have a number of states that have their own mandates regarding COVID-19 procedures. So mostly on the West Coast, East Coast, but also Michigan has their own standard regarding COVID. Virginia is the only state currently that has a permanent standard, and some of those elements of that permanent standard are up there on the screen. That permanent standard requires training regarding non-retaliation, requires employers to conduct risk assessments, requires that employers comply with CDC guidance, which again, we've seen changes all the time. So employers really have to be signed up to the CDC alert system and get those alerts, because this guidance is constantly changing. And if you're going to require that in a standard, that's very burdensome for employers that are also trying to run their business at the same time to keep up with day-to-day guidance by the CDC. So, but the Virginia standard does not contain paid leave or other job protection mandates, like, for instance, California's requirements do. So that would be a bit of good news if the federal standard, if we're going to see one, actually does not have paid leave requirements or job protection mandates. So as you might expect, a number of employers are challenging the legislation, particularly the more restrictive legislation in New York and California. And those cases are sort of winding through the courts now. Those cases are basically challenging the state authority to issue these types of regulations. So we've also had lawsuits in Ohio challenging the governor's authority and the Ohio Department of Health authority to issue some of the restrictions that they've issued. So those cases are mostly on hold because we're expecting OSHA to issue a temporary standard. So a bit of good news as we're trying to digest all of this information and all of these rules that new rules that employers have to comply with. Last September, the Ohio legislature passed civil immunity legislation, and this legislation is designed to protect really employers, public sector employers, private sector employers, for-profits, not-for-profits, religious organizations, public, schools. So is designed to protect those entities from being sued based upon an allegation that their actions actually cause somebody to be exposed to or contract or be infected with COVID-19. This was designed to help employers who are actually either treating healthcare institutions that are treating individuals with COVID, first responders that are being exposed to individuals with COVID, essential businesses, designed to at least take the fear of expensive litigation off of their plate while they're trying to reopen during or stay open or provide essential services during this pandemic. So employers lose that immunity if they act recklessly or intentionally or willful or wantonly, but that's a very high standard to show, and employers don't have to worry about these class action lawsuits brought by numerous employees or plaintiffs' attorneys on behalf of numerous employees that are very expensive to defend. So the civil immunity legislation prohibited those class actions. So that's some good news for employers, provides a little bit of risk mitigation for employers. The troublesome part, in my view, about the civil immunity legislation is that it's sunset, so it only protects claims up till September 30th of this year. So certainly there's going to be claims after that date, and the other states that have sort of jumped on the bandwagon and passed the civil immunity legislation, those sunset much further down the road. Indiana's, for instance, sunsets in 2024. West Virginia just passed those this year. I was looking at it, West Virginia just passed those yesterday, I believe. So I was looking at that legislation, and to me, it didn't appear that there was any sunset provision. So the Ohio legislature is going to have to change that and provide some further protection and extend that out at least a couple more years for employers. You can have workers' comp claims for COVID. So in Ohio, we haven't really seen a flood that a lot of people were expecting of workers' comp claims. There's only been really a little over 3,000 COVID-related claims filed so far. And most of those were filed by workers in the healthcare or first responder field. So we're seeing that's where most of those come from. And if folks aren't in those fields, a COVID workers' comp claim in Ohio is very difficult to establish because you do have to establish causality and how did the workplace cause the person to get COVID. So maybe in the healthcare industry, in a nursing home setting, if you have 70% of the employees in a particular nursing home all contracted COVID, maybe that's one thing. But if you're just working in construction or manufacturing and a couple people contract COVID, I would think it would be very hard for those individuals to actually prove that they contracted COVID in the workplace, at least in Ohio. in other states, there are some different rules, but Ohio, very difficult for most individuals to contract COVID. And the Ohio Bureau of Workers' Comp even says on their website that typically COVID claims would not be compensable under Ohio's workers' compensation system. With this background, now we have really the federal government and President Biden stepping in and issuing some mandates. Late January, he issued a mandate to OSHA to consider a temporary COVID-related standard and also a few other directives. It was one of candidate Biden's campaign promises that he was going to have a nationwide mask mandate, and he was also going to make sure that there was an OSHA standard for employers regarding COVID. So in response to that, OSHA went and issued some guidance about what it believes employers should be doing as far as COVID policies and procedures. So conducting hazard assessments, having written policies and procedures with all of these elements in it. So including training employees, training and education. So most employers have some form of COVID written response plan. Couple interesting things in this January 29th guidance is OSHA specifically said employers should be encouraging sick employees to stay home and minimizing the impact of COVID, of the quarantine due to COVID through policy. So what OSHA is saying is that employers should be providing paid leave to employees for any period of quarantining. They noted record keeping and reporting. They noted implementing non-retaliation provisions, providing no costs vaccines and vaccine-related education, treating vaccinated employees equal with non-vaccinated employees, except for the new quarantine, the new quarantine guidance that we talked about, and of course, furnishing and requiring face covering. So some of this guidance is going to be, if not already, contradictory to certain states' regulations or non-regulations at this point. So we're going to see sort of a clash between the federal government and OSHA's guidance and perhaps a new standard and some states. So stay tuned for that. But these are going to be elements if this new standard comes out today or next week. These are going to be the elements that are going to be included in the new standard that employers are going to have to comply with. So we need to be ready. March 12th, speaking of being ready, March 12th, OSHA has issued a national emphasis program on COVID-19 issues. So that means that OSHA has a list of industries that they believe are particularly susceptible to high incident rates of COVID in the workplace. I put examples down there, and they will randomly pick employers to sort of fill in their inspection docket and go ahead and inspect those employers for COVID issues under this national emphasis program, which is set to begin, I believe, next week. So it actually, they will start doing these inspections next week. So we need to be ready. These issues are what they're going to focus on: record keeping and reporting, personal protective equipment, respiratory protection, sanitation, signage, access to employee exposure records, bloodborne pathogens, and the general duty clause. So employers need to be aware of this and be prepared, and go back and look at what OSHA's guidance said at the end of January, and make sure the written policies and procedures and programs that they have in place for COVID comply with that guidance from OSHA. So record keeping requirements, if there are high incidences, if there are incidences of COVID for your employees, you at least have to make a decision on whether or not we believe that is work-related and should be recorded on your OSHA log. So it doesn't mean that employers have to make medical inquiries, but they should be making reasonable inquiries according to OSHA about, how asking the employee how they contracted that. Do they discuss out-of-work activities that might have led to them contracting COVID? Review the work employment environment for potential exposure. So these are the questions that employers are supposed to ask according to OSHA, and you need to actually make a determination as to whether or not you should put it on your OSHA logs. And if you do put COVID-19 on your OSHA logs, it should be logged in as a quote, a respiratory illness. So regardless of whether you believe that these are work-related, if you make a determination that it's not work-related, or can't make a determination at all that it is work-related, you really need to keep records, because now OSHA is saying we're going to come out and inspect your workplace, and that's one of the things that we're going to look at. So you have to at least make that determination and document the reasons that you don't believe it should be work-related and on your OSHA log. And you may also have to report COVID-related hospitalizations if, in fact, again, you make a determination that those are work-related. And if you don't, then you again need to document those reasons and keep those in the file, and show OSHA if they come down the road, ask you why you didn't report it to them. OSHA is really focused on retaliation issues right now, like laser-like focus on retaliation issues. So part of the National Emphasis Program is going to be making sure that employers are not retaliating against employees that are reporting concerns about workplace safety related to COVID to OSHA or to the employer. So if employees are reporting workplace concerns to you, to the employer, an employer needs to take some action, document that action, that they at least investigated those concerns. And if that employee is subject to some form of adverse employment action shortly after they make a complaint, those will be closely scrutinized by OSHA, and you may have a retaliation claim on your hands, even if the underlying complaint had no merit whatsoever. This is a tough concept for a lot of employers to grasp, and certainly frontline supervisors. So even if you know as an employer that this employee is just complaining about a lot of different things, and one of them happens to be he or she threw in a complaint about feeling unsafe because people weren't wearing masks, you need to do your due diligence and investigate that and respond and keep a record of that to defend these retaliation cases, even if the underlying complaint has no merit at all. So part of a good anti-retaliation program is training your supervisors not to retaliate when employees complain about these types of issues. OSHA investigations and inspections are serious business. The penalties are, up to this year, $13,653 for just a serious, a repeat or willful is a maximum penalty amount of $136,532 for one citation, one willful citation. So we really need to focus, hone in on some of these OSHA issues, because there will probably be a new standard. Marty Walsh just got confirmed as the head of the secretary for the Department of Labor yesterday. So some were speculating that this new standard, the reason why OSHA was waiting past March 15th, which is when the president said they should issue the new standard, a lot of people were speculating that, well, maybe people were just waiting until Marty Walsh was approved as the head of the Department of Labor. Now that he is, we should expect this new OSHA temporary standard soon. That's going to be one of his first priorities. So again, here are a lot of your areas of potential risk for employers. Not providing leave to folks related to COVID and quarantine issues might be inconsistent with the way you treat other types of leave. So we have to guard against that. Some of these COVID leaves might also fall under the Family and Medical Leave Act, if that applies to you, and not accommodating disabilities. There'd be COVID-related disabilities, wage and hour issues related to COVID policies. There's a case out there right now in New Jersey where one of the claims is that employees should be paid for the time they spent getting their temperatures checked and answering the employer's screening questions prior to work. And the claim is that the employer didn't pay them for that time, and they should have been paid for that time. And so we have to be careful about those. We talked about OSHA, Ohio Retail Compliance Unit. If you're in the retail business, there's a Ohio unit that goes and does inspections, see if people are wearing face covering. So interestingly, the compliance rate in Ohio is 95% and up for those inspections. Again, defending retaliation claims, also union grievances regarding unsafe workplaces, union grievances regarding employers not negotiating these COVID-related policies that could impact the terms and conditions of employment. So a lot of information to digest in less than an hour. And surely we will be seeing more and more changes, and probably a federal OSHA standard that we're all going to have to deal with. But given the success rate of the vaccines and what we're seeing from the studies on the vaccines being 95% effective and really nearly 100% effective in reducing hospitalizations and fatalities due to COVID, certainly maybe we are seeing the rainbow after the storm. So I don't know how much time I have for questions.